Hi, everybody. My name is Vivian Schiller. I am the Executive Director of Aspen Digital. We are a program of the Aspen Institute that focuses on all things at the intersection of media, the internet, and technology. Thank you for joining us. This is the latest of our Disinfo discussion series, hosted again by the Aspen Institute, in which we are examining various facets of the information crisis in this country and elsewhere. These sessions are designed as a resource for our Commission on Information Disorder to help inform their work, but they are also very much for the public as well. Today, we are talking about the role of the news media, and especially the role of local news, which has been decimated in recent years. So I am so fortunate today to have not just one, but three renowned leaders in media and journalism who are experts on this topic. First, we have Margaret Sullivan. She is the media columnist at the Washington Post. She was formerly New York Times public editor, and before that, for many years, the top editor at for the Buffalo News. She literally wrote the book on this topic. It's called Ghosting the News: Local Journalism and the Crisis of American Democracy. We also have Lauren Williams, co-founder, CEO, and editor-in-chief of Capital B, a Black-led, nonprofit, local and national news organization reporting for Black communities across the country. It will be launching this fall. She was most recently the senior vice president and editor-in-chief of Vox here in Washington, D.C. And finally, we have Steve Waldman. Steve is a social entrepreneur and the president and founder of Report for America. This is an initiative of Ground Truth, a nationwide effort to bring a new generation of journalists to serve in community news organizations across the country. He was also, importantly for this topic, the author of the seminal FCC report called Information Needs of Communities, the Changing Media Landscape in a Broadband Age. So thank you so much, all of you, for joining us. We are going to talk not just about the crisis in local news, but what it's got to do with mis and disinformation, and spoiler alert, a lot is the answer. So Margaret, I'm going to start with you. Just sort of tell us broadly what has happened in the last decade and a half when it's come to local news. What is the scope of the crisis? Why the decline? How big is the decline and why?
Okay, well, thank you, Vivian, and thanks for having me. This is a great group and a topic that's really important and near to my heart. The landscape is that the business model that supported local journalism, particularly local newspapers, which have been the heart of local journalism for such a long time, that business model has pretty much fallen apart. Not completely and not everywhere, but as a general statement, it's really suffered over the past 2 decades. And the biggest reason for that is that print advertising, which has been the lifeblood of local newspapers, has, well, now it hasn't gone away entirely, but it has diminished severely. And if you ever look at a chart of what's happened to print advertising, you know, from sort of 20 years ago to now, it's a very steep decline, and it explains a lot. When I talk about this, I always like to be crystal clear that local newspapers are not the only part of local journalism. You know, there's radio, there's local TV, there are many new nonprofit sites and new digital sites of all kinds. People are doing innovative stuff. Obviously, Lauren and Steve have done a lot of innovative stuff, but it's still really troubling because the number of local journalists in communities in metro areas has diminished radically. And that means that less, you know, accountability and community journalism is getting done. Over the past roughly 20 years, a little bit less than that, 2,000 newspapers have gone out of business in the United States. And that has actually only gotten worse since COVID began, because it kicked what was left of print advertising to the curb. So, you know, there's a lot to say about this, but at least that's a start.
Yeah, thank you. Lauren, let me turn to you. talk a little bit about, you're obviously starting a series of what will be a number of local based news organizations organized nationally, but rooted in their local communities. So why did you think this important? Why is the decline of local news coverage? How does that affect communities?
Well, when we were, just to sort of set the scene of when my co-founder and I decided to do this last summer, it was a really intense moment in the news in our country. Black Lives Matter protests were happening. Black and brown people were dying disproportionately from COVID. The election was ramping up. And the thing that my co-founder and I really couldn't get out of our heads was that there were people out there, the very people who had the most at stake in the outcome of the election that was ramping up, who had the most, who were, in the most danger in the public health crisis, who had the most at stake in the question of the future of American criminal justice, who weren't getting the information that they needed to really, understand or be a part of these debates that were kind of raging at the national level. And so when we thought about a news organization that we were creating, it had to be something that was going to address local news. And for us as Black journalists, even at its strongest, local news in America doesn't have a really amazing history of fairly or comprehensively covering marginalized communities. So the combination of a crisis in local news and a kind of historic failure of coverage meant that Black communities across the country, really needed some attention in the local news space. And we felt like that was a place where we could make a difference. And I didn't even mention the fact that Black communities are explicitly targeted for disinformation around, elections. And so it's really a perfect storm. And there's an enormous need for trustworthy news. And we saw a place for us.
Yeah. And we'll talk in a little bit more about what is that, where are other green shoots? Where are there opportunities for more local news? But before we do, let's just look a little bit more about the current situation. So Steve, let me turn to you. You've been studying this issue for a long time. And in fact, your FCC report, sort of signaled a lot of what was, and it's all just accelerated in the 10 years. Has it been 10 years since you wrote that report, and the risk of declining local news on democracy? With local news organizations, the number of local journalists, the number of local news organizations declining over recent years, where are people getting their information? What do you see, and what does that say about their the information, about the diet information that they're getting at the local level?
Well, this is where we get into what I believe is the case, which is that the collapse of local news probably is a key cause of the rise of misinformation, and it is certainly a key solution to countering misinformation because of what you said, vacuums. Local news has created vacuums. The collapse of local news has created vacuums. People are filling that, firstly, by going to national cable news, talk radio, social media. In other words, they're not filling it with other local sources. They're filling it with misinformation and national news. And that leads to more disinformation and more polarization. So we're
losing you, Steve. So I'm gonna, while you're getting your signal back, I'm gonna come back. Margaret, maybe you want to pick this up.
Sure.
So if you're not,
I do.
doing that.
Oh, sorry. We lost you for a minute, Steve. Let's see. Do we have your connection back?
Oh, I'm sorry. Where did I drop off?
Oh, that's okay. We can edit this part out, by the way. So no worries about it. You were talking about vacuums, and then you froze.
Oh God, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
when the vacuums that have arisen as a result of the collapse of local news are being filled by people going to national cable news, going to social media, and going to all sorts of sources of disinformation and conspiracy theories. So it's not that, it's been filled by some other local source. It's been filled by national, often very partisan, very polarized, and very often not accurate information. So if you want to talk about how you're going to counter the problems of misinformation, you have to look at also strengthening the local news system.
Let me stick with you for a follow-up, Steve. So, a lot of people suggest that the platforms, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, are that are directly sort of hoovering up the revenue that would have gone to, not only hoovering up the revenue that would have gone to local news organizations, but also filling that vacuum again with not reliable, not edited, not independent journalism. To what extent is that the case? You sort of pointed to cable news and talk radio. What does your research show about where people are actually getting that information that they're not getting from a local news organization?
It's both. It is certainly true that social media is the big new player, but I'll point out that when I did the FCC report in 2011, Facebook and Google were barely a factor at that point, and yet we were still predicting a collapse of local news because the internet, before there was Google and Facebook, there were other parts of the internet that started to take away that revenue. And once the vacuum was created, it's been a variety of different things that have filled the vacuum. Before it was social, you still had talk radio and national cable, and now social is playing a bigger role.
Yeah, Margaret, one of the interesting things that when you look at surveys about trust in media, it's so interesting because so many surveys, people will universally, if asked about sort of the media, people will say they don't trust the media. I don't know what the media means, but there you go. But yet when you ask people about their local news organization or a local reporter, television reporter, or a local NPR station or a local online site, then those trust levels go up much higher. So what do you, having worked in local news for so many years, what do you attribute that to?
Well, there's an interesting phenomenon when you ask people about whether they trust the media. It's a little misleading in some ways because, if you ask, I'm a columnist who writes about the media, and I've spent my entire career in journalism, and I really care about the press and the role of the press. But if you ask me if I trust the media, I'm not sure I trust the media all that much either. It depends. Are we talking about, the Washington Post and the New York Times and CNN on the one hand, basically, or are we talking about, Fox News and some of the so-called pink slime sites that are presenting themselves as local, but really aren't doing reporting. So, but I think that people have greater trust in local news, in sort of mainstream local news, like a newspaper or their public radio station or their TV station, because when they're reporting on local issues, if you live in that community and over time that they basically get it right, they make mistakes, but they get it right, you develop a sense that they're basically dependable. And you might also actually know the people who are in those news organizations. Your kid might go to school with somebody, a reporter's kid, whatever it is. There's a sense of community there that you are not going to get from, including the big national outlets. So also in terms of the numbers about trust, it's interesting because if you ask people about the media, and you rightly say, who knows what that means? And then you ask them about, sort of my media, like my news sources, it's far higher. So that's not just about local and national. It's also about, what I go to. Do I listen to NPR? Do I, watch the TV news? It's like, you do sort of self-select a little bit, and there it goes up, which is not to say that there isn't a huge problem. There is a huge problem. Yeah. And one other thing I'd add is, I've made it a point to talk to news consumers, also known as, sort of like regular people, about their news habits.
At least you didn't call them end users.
Yeah, no, not end users, right? And one thing I have found is that people who do have a regular sort of local news habit, they either subscribe to the local paper or they, just whatever it is, that they do tend to have somewhat less, more moderate. I don't mean politically moderate, but they are not as deep into their filter bubbles as others. And I think that's one of that filter bubble thing is one of the big problems that we have. And it's something that local news is well equipped to overcome.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier, I couldn't agree more, by the way. You mentioned earlier pink slime sites. Just explain briefly what that is.
Well, I actually don't know why they're called that, but there are sites, maybe some of you do.
I think it's from the old hamburger stuff, but anyway.
Oh, maybe so. Yeah. There are sites all over the country that have the names of what sound like local newspapers, like the something or other Gazette or the, Beacon, Herald Beacon or something, but they're not local newspapers and they're not traditional news organizations. They're basically hyper partisan sites that are attempting to sell a particular political point of view, often not through journalism, but through something pretty close to propaganda. But it's hard for people who may not be extraordinarily news literate to know the difference between them. And they're pretty dangerous in that way.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, news literacy is another topic that we are diving deep into in other episodes. Lauren, I think interesting that there is, a lot of nostalgia in some quarters for, the good old days when local media was thriving, when, your town had a morning newspaper and an evening newspaper and, everybody was making lots of money. But I would submit, and I'd love to hear you say more about this, that even back in those glory, so-called good old days, there were communities, local communities that were left out of coverage and also were left out of media that served their needs. So I would imagine with capital B and other media for underrepresented communities, it's not just about sort of regaining or recapturing coverage, but creating it maybe for the first time.
Yeah, definitely. I don't want to discount that there, has been a really thriving and amazing history of Black press in this country that arose for the exact reasons that you're describing. But this Black press has been hit hard by the same local news crisis that has hit all newspapers, and in some ways hit even harder because many of these newspapers were small, family owned, didn't have the infrastructure of a larger media company to help the transition to digital or to absorb some of the costs of the losses, and so they're really diminished. And so yes, we want to come in and do some things in communities that have literally never been done there before, cover some neighborhoods that the mainstream newspapers have never covered. And we want to also do a kind of journalism that connects a little closer to the community than newspapers have done before. Hopefully create maybe a different kind of trust that might break through a little bit and solve some of the issues that we're talking about here.
So Lauren, your work with capital B is part of a wave of solutions that people are, entrepreneurs like yourself are creating in terms of trying to figure out how to fill the void of local news. So let's talk about what other options there are out there. Steve, you were part of one of those solutions, and certainly you should talk for a minute about Report for America, but also share with us where you see sort of other promising ways that local news void can be filled in.
Well, Report for America, we describe it as a national service program that places talented journalists into local communities. We just announced 300 reporters into more than 200 newsrooms around the country. And the newsrooms compete, and what they have to prove is that there's a news desert, there's a gap in coverage. And then the talented reporters are paired with those newsrooms. And our goal is to get to 1,000 reporters by 2024. It is an exciting moment. There's a lot of interesting, innovative things going on out there. There's several hundred local nonprofit news. Now, when we say nonprofit, people immediately think of public radio or public TV. That's actually is part of what's going on. There's some public radio stations are doing more local reporting. But there's this whole new class of nonprofit websites, mostly digital first, several hundred of them that are doing this. There are national nonprofit organizations that have popped up just in the last few years. Report for America, American Journalism Project, Solutions Journalism, the Borealis Fund, what Lauren is doing. It's an exciting time of innovation in the nonprofit space. And then the last piece, which is very unformed, is that there is, for the first time in a long time, a discussion about public policy and whether the government ought to be playing a role in helping to support local news.
And should it? You and I have talked about this before, so that's a little bit of a leading question.
Yes, if it's very careful. I think the concerns about government getting in there and, the federal government giving Donald Trump Jr. when he's president, giving out grants to local newspapers, that's a lot could go wrong with that. So you have to be really careful about this basic kind of paradox that, like, isn't it kind of weird that the muck makers would be giving money to the muck rakers? There is kind of a conflict there, but there are ways of doing it. For just as one possible example, if you gave a refundable tax credit to people to buy subscriptions to local news or make a donation to a local news nonprofit, then it's the consumer making the choice, not the government. And then that gets to be closer to the much beloved postal subsidy that everyone always talks about of the 18th century as the holy grail of media policy, because it was content neutral. It wasn't a government official deciding who the winners and losers would be.
Yeah, well, I think we can all agree we don't want government officials deciding which news organizations are better than others. Margaret, go ahead.
No.
Oh yeah, okay. I would, what can the news industry itself? There are many successful national news organizations. There are, lots of small news organizations springing up. What can the news industry itself do to help? And also, how much, a separate question, how important is ownership? And I guess this is a little bit of a leading question because we're seeing newspapers being bought up by hedge funds.
Right. Well, to work backwards, ownership is really important. There are hedge funds that have, their real names are things like Alden Global Capital, but they have, sort of a name that makes them sound a little bit more acceptable, like Digital First or something like that. But basically, chain ownership of newspapers has become extraordinarily common and in fact the norm. I worked for a paper for many years, the Buffalo News, which was owned by Warren Buffett and Berkshire Hathaway, and we were very, very independent. And now it is part of a chain. It's part of Lee Enterprises. So almost all newspapers are part of a chain these days. But I would say that there are some examples of local newspapers that are doing okay. And the ones that are doing okay, and they're relatively rare, tend to have a few things in common. One is they have a local owner who is wealthy and who can at least give you some kind of a cushion. They have, they have a strong connection to all parts of their community, and they have made the digital transition. Probably they're still in print, but they've kind of crossed the bridge over into into productive and successful digital journalism. And so, you know, a couple examples are the Boston Globe and the Minneapolis Star Tribune. And I think that, you know, that a lot of newspapers, given the chance to learn from that, can mimic some of it.
You know, there's one other example I would add to what Margaret said, which is newspapers that have become nonprofits.
Yes.
They've either Salt Lake Tribune, Philadelphia Inquirer, St. Petersburg. And it's a really interesting model. And it makes me think that in addition to reforming existing entities, and in addition to doing startups, there's a third category we should be looking at, which is what we call replanting. Taking newspapers that might be owned by a hedge fund and replanting them into a community institution. Could be a local nonprofit, a community foundation, maybe a public radio station. But the key is what you were talking about before, a different ownership structure, so that it has the burdens of the ownership structure lifted, and it can focus on getting to sustainability in the community.
Yeah, it's interesting because that's how public radio stations work. They may be planted in a university, a college or a university, in a community organization or some other enterprise. You know, speaking of nonprofits, it doesn't matter. I'll ask this question to you, Lauren. You know, should we, as the public, does it matter whether a news entity is a not-for-profit or a for-profit?
In terms of what? Does it matter to a reader, or
should it matter? Does it matter to trust towards? I mean, you were part of Vox, which is a for-profit. Now you're starting a not-for-profit. So I mean, is there as a member of the public, should I care one way or the other? I mean, I have sort of an answer to this myself, whether an institution is a for-profit or not-for-profit. There's just a lot of discussion these days about not-for-profit news organizations.
In my opinion, it is a business side decision. And I think that good journalism is good journalism. And if done really well and really honestly, I don't think that there's a for-profit style of journalism and a nonprofit style of journalism that's going to be significantly different for a reader, where you read something in the New York Times and that's a for-profit story, and you read something in ProPublica and that's a nonprofit story. But I think that it's, I think that it's for me as a founder, it was a meaningful decision coming from for-profit, knowing that I was, really wanted to launch a local news network. Nonprofit really seemed to be my only option in doing that.
So part of that was a business imperative.
Yes.
So we are going to move to, we're just about out of time. So I'm going to move to a final question I'd like to ask each of you. So these discussions, as I mentioned at the top, are intended to inform members of the Commission on Information Disorder, as well as the general public. Is there anything about both the crisis in the local news gap and the potential solutions, that you think the Commission should know as they prioritize what issues they want to focus on and what solutions they may come up with for government or the private sector or civil society? So, Margaret, I'll turn to you first.
Well, I do think that local news has to be part of the answer, a big part of the answer, if there is an answer to the disinformation problem. And it's a huge problem. We don't really have a common basis of facts anymore. I mean, the facts are there, it's just that they're not commonly believed. And I don't think that it can be addressed without getting down into the community level. So I don't think you can just address it with, sort of some kind of federal commission or, news literacy ordered for all schools or something like that. You have to have trusted forms of news in cities and communities, in small towns. So I think that if you were to come up with a 4-part solution to disinformation, I strongly believe that fostering and really fixing the local news crisis must be one of those 3 or 4 things.
Yeah. Lauren.
I agree. You can't fix this problem. There has to be something to replace the bad information, and that has to be with good information. And so when it's not there, there's no way for it to be fixed. I also think that when you think about communities actively being specifically targeted, there needs to be targeted solutions for those communities. So, we know that Black communities are being targeted with disinformation, and there needs to be targeted solutions for those communities around that disinformation. And I think that is incredibly important in thinking about this. And I also think that, and we're thinking about this a lot as we're, trying to figure out the best way to build trust with communities that we enter as we're building capital B, is that, there has to be some way to connect with people and build trust with them in ways that that go beyond, the social connections on social media and the way that this disinformation is happening. Like we have to create more connections with the news that we're delivering to people, with the information that we're delivering people, that really goes beyond what local news and other information providers have provided before, in order to build that trust, so that when we go to tell them that this thing is not true, that we've made those connections and we've built those connections. And obviously that's a huge undertaking and a big challenge, but I do believe that has to happen in order for us to get to that next step.
That relationship with the public.
Yes.
Steve.
Honestly, I think strengthening local news is the single most important thing that has to be done to counter misinformation. So I completely agree with what Margaret and Lauren have said. And I will add one extra element, which is it also is crucial for dealing with alienation and polarization. So the same studies that showed what Vivian was talking about before about the collapse of trust also showed that in communities that have less local news, people feel more alienated from their communities. They feel like the government doesn't speak for me, the community doesn't speak for me. And those same communities also have less split ticket voting, meaning it more polarized. So the collapse of local news is correlated absolutely with the rise of disinformation, but it's also correlated with the rise of alienation and polarization. So I feel like strengthening local news is absolutely key part of the puzzle.
Steve, Lauren, Margaret, thank you so much. This was really informative, and I appreciate the passion which you are bringing to this, as well as solutions. So thanks again for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.